First of all, let me start by saying this. I supported the humanitarian aid to the Ukraine, which is what we were told initially was the mission. Although I was suspicious of it, and my son, as I've mentioned, actually went over, left law school, did not tell us where he was going, and went over and joined the Foreign Legion, and fought in the Kharkiv offensive with a special forces group. He was served as a machine gunner. He was in engagements with the Russians. But he feels the same way, essentially, that I do, that this is no longer a humanitarian mission, that all the decisions the United States has made since the start have been about prolonging the war, about maximizing the violence of the war, and being absolutely intransigent against the many opportunities to actually settle the war. And that my understanding of the war is that not that Zelensky is pushing this war as hard as he can, but that the neocons in the White House want this war. They want regime change with the Russians. They want to exhaust the Russian armies. This is what Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said in 2022. Our objective is to exhaust and degrade Russian forces so they cannot fight anywhere else in the world. And President Biden acknowledged that one of his objectives in the war is regime change in Russia, removing Vladimir Putin. Well, if those are the objectives, that is the opposite of a humanitarian mission. That is a mission to maximize casualties, to prolong the war. It's essentially a war of attrition, and that's what we're seeing. And the brunt of this is being paid by the flower of Ukrainian youth. There have been over 300,000. This is something that the U.S. government and the Ukrainian government have worked hard to hide, the number of casualties, which has been catastrophic. This is the most violent conflict since World War II that's taken place probably anywhere in the world. And the casualties are enormous. Over 300,000 Ukrainian dead. The Russians are killing Ukrainian, depending on who you believe, at a ratio of 5-1 to 8-1. Which was the 7-1 in the recently leaked, whistleblower leaked Pentagon documents. And the Russians cannot lose this war. We're being told they're losing. They cannot afford to lose this war. This is existential for them. And they have been building up their forces. They have a 10-1 artillery advantage on us, and this is an artillery war. So it's simply, and we do not have the artillery to replace what we've lost over there. This is a war that is proceeding in a very cataclysmic trajectory. And the answer to your question about how we got in this war goes back a long way, but I would say that the real story starts in 2014 when the U.S. government, and particularly the neocons in the White House and elsewhere, participated and supported the violent overthrow, a coup d'etat against the democratically elected government of the Ukraine, and put in a very, very anti-Russian government. This prompted the Russians, who then believed that the U.S. Navy was now going to be invited into the Black Sea to have a port at Crimea. It prompted the Russians to preemptively invade Crimea. At the same time, the government that came into the Ukraine began enacting a series of laws that turned the Russian populations of the Donbass region into second-class citizens. They illegalized essentially their culture, their language, and they began ultimately killing them. They killed 14,000 of them. And it prompted a civil war in the country. And the Russian response, which it was illegal, I have no sympathy or toward Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is a gangster and he's a thug. But his response in the Donbass was not irrational.
So I guess the question becomes, if you were elected president, would you stop sending armaments to Ukraine?
I would immediately have a ceasefire, and I would settle the war. And I think it can be settled. I don't even know. I mean, listen, the best settlement for this war was outlined in the Minsk Accords in 2014. Mm-hmm. And the Minsk Accords, which all the European countries agreed upon, was when the Russians and the Russian people in Donbass voted to leave Russia, and Russia did not want them. Russia said, no, let's develop an accord, an agreement which would make Donbass an autonomous region within the Ukraine, which would agree to not put missile systems in Ukraine, NATO missile systems, which would agree that Ukraine would not join NATO.
If Zelensky says, no, I want to keep fighting, would you stop sending U.S. weapons?
I would settle this. I would settle this war. The Ukraine cannot fight without U.S. support.
So then at some point you would tell Zelensky, if I'm reading into what you're saying correctly, hey, settle it or we're out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would settle the war.
Yeah.
Do you think that we somehow allowed Zelensky to believe that we would allow him into NATO? Meaning, do you think that U.S. foreign policy somehow almost induced this thing to happen? I just want to try to understand the boundaries.
We have been doing integrative military exercises with the Ukrainian military. So we were actively integrating them into NATO forces. There was no question that, the one thing that Putin said from the outset, this is a red line. When my uncle was president, one of the things that he said a couple of things. He said, number one, the principal job of a president of the United States is to keep the nation out of war. And he succeeded doing that during his term in office. He sent 16,000 military advisors to Vietnam who were not authorized to participate in combat. That didn't mean that some of them didn't. They were not authorized. And in fact, that was fewer federal troops than he sent to get James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. So he sent fewer to Vietnam, and 2 weeks before he died, he signed a national security order ordering all of those troops home by 1965, with the first 1,000 to come home that month by November. And he died 2 weeks later. So, and then, of course, Johnson came in and remanded the war and sent 250,000 troops over there, which is what all of my uncle's military advisors wanted him to do. Yeah. And he stood up to them. One of the other things my uncle said, and, the anniversary of his speech at American University, which is an extraordinary speech, probably one of the best in American history. Jeff Sachs has called it the most important speech in American history. It was a speech to the American people. And it's an extraordinary speech because if you read it, it's asking them to put themselves into the shoes of the Russians and understand that the Russians bore the brunt of World War II. They lost 1 out of every 13 Russians died in that war. A third of their country was occupied and leveled to the ground. It's like he said, it's as if the entire East Coast of the United States to Chicago was put into rubble. And he described this in detail for the American people to say, we're all people, we're all on an arc, and we need to understand each other's motives and not just vilify each other. And what we're seeing now is this formulaic vilification, this narrative that we saw with Saddam Hussein, with Putin, with every little war that we want to get into. Those guys are pure evil, we're pure good, and we're going to go rescue, the damsel in distress.
Just on that, could you contrast and compare just maybe the last 3 or 4 presidents on this very narrow dimension of JFK's promise of what a president should be doing, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden? How do you see the things that these guys have gotten right and or very wrong here? On that dimension, just on that dimension.
I've been friends with Joe Biden for many, many years. Joe Biden is, he's a go-to-war guy. He was one of the strongest supporters of the Iraq War. He's been a supporter of every war that's come along. And that, I think that's one of the reasons that, some of those, that portion of the Democratic Party, which is a very, very powerful kind of kingpickers, was very happy with him getting in office is that he never says no to a war. I think Trump, I liked a lot of what Trump said about foreign policy, about disentangling us from this knee-jerk reaction of constant wars, and that the cost that imposes on our country. What it's doing, it's hollowing out our middle class. But then Trump did a lot of things, including walking away from the intermediate nuclear missile treaty, which was another provocation for Russia, because that treaty, we're putting these intermediate missile systems all along the Russian border in Romania and Poland, and in Ukraine, and that those missiles can hit Cuba. Can hit Moscow in a few minutes. So there was a very destabilizing system. We all signed it, and he walked away from it. And that, I think that was another provocation. We should be de-escalating these provocations, though. The why it did NATO. This is what George Kennan said after the Soviet Union collapsed. Why do we even have NATO anymore? Why do we have it? Why do we have it unless we're going to involve the Russians in it? Why don't we do a Marshall Plan for Russia? We won the war. They are the losers. They admit they're the losers. They want to join the European community. Let's make that easy for them. Let's not continue to treat them as if they're the enemy, because that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that, unfortunately, is what we did.
Let's pivot then. You want to contain, and you would force everybody to the table to a resolution, if I'm understanding correctly. You weren't explicit in terms of would you remove support, but I think we can infer from it you would have a point at which you would stop sending armaments to Ukraine.
We have tremendous moral pressure and economic pressure and everything else on Ukraine.
How about this, Jason? Would you be willing to take NATO expansion off the table if it helps resolve this conflict?
Yeah, everybody
Because Biden won't. Well, Biden won't, right?
Yeah, no, it's
absolutely. Why are we trying to expand? We gave our word that we would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east, and now we've gone into 13 countries. It is a provocation.